Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Sofia and I'm going to be talking about how you can use electrochemistry to determine your bone health. So all this data is part of my final year project as part of my degree in biomedical engineering that I'm doing within the University of Glasgow, and I carry all this research at the University of Cambridge, so this project was funded by the European Space Agency. So before I start, I want to give a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to give a brief introduction into the project, so what's the project about, what were the aims. Then I'm going to discuss a bit the methods that I was using, present just very briefly, some of the results, and then conclusions and suggestions for future work. So let's start. So as it is said on the title, I'm focusing on bone. And bone is a dynamic organ which is in constant remodeling by the action of two specialized cell types. These are named osteoclast and osteoblast. So osteoclast reabsorb bone, while osteoblast produce new bone matrix. So basically, if the action of the osteoclast is much greater than the osteoblast, your bones will lose density and therefore mechanical strength, which is a clear feature of a disease called osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is associated with aging, also certain drug treatments, and astronauts are also prone to develop this illness because they don't have the gravitational force acting on their bones. So naturally, these two cell types produce a protein in blood called rankyle, and high levels of rankyle in blood have been associated with the development of a disease. Osteoporosis is currently diagnosed with a very expensive and complex equipment. So this brings the possibility of developing a biosensor that will be able to diagnose osteoporosis quicker and faster and cheaper. So great, let's build a biosensor to diagnose osteoporosis. And one of the first things we need to think about is how are we actually going to detect that protein in blood? And this is generally achieved through a technique called surface functionalization. So in our case, we were using surface chemistry. So we will modify the chemistry on the surface by attaching what is called a recognitional element. And this recognitional element has a specific binding site for the protein. So in theory, rankyle is the protein that would only be able to bind to the surface, nothing else. Then there are many techniques that you can use to quantify that interaction between the protein and the recognitional element, and we were using electrochemical ones. So with that said, the project had the goal of electrochemically detect rankyle. And when the project was started a year before I joined, they were using what is called screen-printed electrodes, here shown on the slide. This is just a schematic of the chemistry they were using. I'm not going to focus on the details about this, but the idea is that with this approach, they were facing three main issues. So there was a lack of reproducibility. This means that if you were performing the experiments, you will get different results. There was also a large variability, meaning that if you were performing the experiments in different devices at the same time, the results would also be different. And then there was non-specific binding. This meant that there was something else apart from rankyle that was binding to the surface. So with that in mind, I joined the research and I wanted to find a solution for these problems. And I did this by adopting two major changes. So first, I started to use what is called microfabricated electrodes, here shown on the slide, instead of the other devices. And then I added gold nanoparticles into the chemistry. So gold nanoparticles are very, very tiny round particles that you can put on the surface with the idea of increasing the surface area for those recognitional elements to bind. And great, so how do these signals or electrochemical measurements look like? So for you to have a better idea, this is the device I was using. So it's a potentiostat, and it's just like how it looks here. And how it works is you apply an electric input into the surface and you will measure the response. And this response will give you some information about what is happening in the surface. Are there proteins binding? Are proteins not binding? And these are just the type of signals I will be receiving in the computer. You don't need to remember anything from this, just the fact that as you add more biological components on the surface, your resistance value will increase. So given the short time for this presentation, I'm going to only discuss the influence of the gold nanoparticles within the performance of the device. So I'm going to discuss how the gold nanoparticles affect the surface conductivity. This means how easy the electric signal is flowing, and also how the gold nanoparticles would influence the surface homogeneity, so how well that coated could be found. So to look at the surface conductivity, I was taking electrochemical measurements before and after the gold nanoparticles were added. And as you see here on the slide, well, you see that once the gold nanoparticles are added, the resistance values greatly drops. This means that the conductivity at the surface increases. So this matches with my expectations. Now, to see how the gold nanoparticles were influencing the surface homogeneity, I performed an optical experiment. So I had 4 glass slides that I functionalized in 4 different ways. So here, initial refers to the protocol that was used by the research group before I joined, and AUNP stands for gold nanoparticles and refers to the new protocol I was developing. So I functionalized the surface, I took these images that are called confocal microscopy, and then I measured the intensity of the signal using a data analysis software. And this is what is shown here on the table. And from this experiment, I conclude 2 major things. First, when I use the gold nanoparticle approach, the surface homogeneity is much better, as you see if you compare the 2 images on the right with the 2 images on the left. And second, as I was expecting, using the gold nanoparticles increases that surface area for the recognition element to bind, because the signal is also higher if you look at the table. So great, this is very promising, but then I wanted to see if I would arrive to the same conclusion if I was to analyze this from an electrochemical perspective instead of optical. So I took electrochemical measurements once I have functionalized 2 different surfaces with the initial protocol and my new protocol. And as you see, the signals taken at different sensing points are much more homogeneous if I use my new protocol in comparison with the previous one. So great. So basically, based on the results I have presented here, I conclude to have achieved a novel protocol to detect rank high protein, and I have shown you how you can use the gold nanoparticles not only to enhance the surface conductivity, but also to improve the surface homogeneity. So, as I said, this proves that I can actually detect with this method rank high in solution. But I think this technology has much more potential than just that. So for instance, if I was to change the chemistry, I would be able to detect many other proteins that I would be interested in. This meant that I could diagnose not only osteoporosis, but many other diseases. And if I was to continue working on this project, what I would love to do is exploring the possibility of using what is called a microfluidic channel. This would enable me to detect different proteins in different points. And so yeah, that would be really interesting. So I would envision this as a device that you will go to the clinic and the doctor will give it to you to be able to quicker, faster diagnose different diseases. And I want to end up with the presentation with a special thank you to all the people that support me throughout my project. It was an incredible experience, both from a personal and professional perspective, and I wouldn't be able to have done it without them. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.